All right, let's start with the digestive system. So way back in chapter 1, I know it was a long time ago for some of us, we learned about certain characteristics of organisms. One of those characteristics is metabolism. And so there's two types of metabolism. You have anabolism. You start with a lot of small things and make them into bigger things. So like growth, like when you want to make a protein, you take amino acids, bond them together, and eventually you'll get a protein. And then there's catabolism, which is you start with something large and break it down into a bunch of smaller pieces. And that's where digestive system comes into play. All right, so don't lose track of that main concept. Our whole goal is to start with something big, right, and then chop it up into smaller pieces. And we're going to talk about how we're going to be able to do that. So let's start off with our functions, okay? So you have ingestion, motility, secretion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. All right, so we're going to start off here with ingestion. Easy. You put something in your mouth, okay? You're swallowing it down. That's what either it's a liquid or it's a solid. So you're going to pour that into your mouth, probably chew on it, hopefully, unless you're a slob, okay? And then you're going to then swallow it down. So ingestion includes that. Motility, think of movement. So we're going to be talking about how both skeletal muscles and smooth muscles, both voluntary and involuntary muscle tissue, is going to help move things throughout your digestive tract. Right? And so a lot of it in the distal portion of the middle and distal portion of the digestive tract is going to be mainly smooth muscle. Okay, you're going to see some skeletal muscle activity in the initial part of the digestive tract, and then you'll see it at the distal part of the digestive tract. So while this is all happening with ingestion and motility, then we're going to be adding things to the stuff that we ingested. Okay, we're going to be adding like enzymes, for example, or like when you put some things in your mouth, your saliva is going to mix in with some of those contents there and will help with what we call chemical digestion. So you have certain enzymes in your saliva that help to break down, right, certain macromolecules, and we'll talk about that. And then, right, we're going to see throughout the digestive tract, you have accessory organs, and some of those accessory organs are going to contribute secretions, like, for example, bile, which is made in the liver, stored and concentrated in the gallbladder. That is going to be secreted in the digestive tract to help with what we call emulsification of lipids, or breaking down of fats, essentially. So we'll talk about that as we move through. Right, so those are the first three functions. And then our last three is, of course, the whole purpose of this chapter is digestion, where we're going to break down large structures into smaller ones. And I want you to know there's two types of digestion. Mechanical digestion, literally when you put something in your mouth and you start to chew on it, right? That's the mechanical aspect. You're physically breaking things down into smaller parts and pieces. And then you have chemical digestion. And chemical digestion is hugely important for the breaking of chemical bonds. So you'll have bonds in between, for example, your amino acids, what we call peptide bonds. And so the chemical digestion will help to break down those peptide bonds so we can separate off those individual amino acids there. Again, that whole process is to make larger molecules into smaller ones, polypeptides or proteins down into, right, individual amino acids or dipeptides. So we'll go through all that. And then finally, the whole purpose of us eating things and ingesting things, okay, is to absorb it into, all right, our bloodstream or into our lymphatic system. Primarily, a lot of the fat material goes into the lymphatic system, and then all the other macromolecules usually go into your bloodstream. So like proteins, all right, carbohydrates, that sort of thing. And so we're going to absorb not only that, but we talked a little bit, like example for water. And we learned when you increase your blood volume, you increase your blood pressure. So where did we get that water from? We ingested it because the hypothalamus made us thirsty if we were dehydrated, for example. And so we ingested it into our digestive system, and then we absorbed it from the digestive system into our bloodstream, and then from our bloodstream, it helped to increase the blood volume. So we'll talk about all the nice, wonderful things that we're going to take in and absorb across the lining there of the digestive tract. And then finally, elimination. right? So you're going to, like everybody and most organisms, when you eat, you're eventually going to poop, all right, or pee. And so that's what we're going to see here. So to kind of simplify things, I want you to think of the digestive tract as one long tube. And if you were to take an embryology class, you learn that in the beginning. It's just one long tube. And then as you develop, right, we start to make modifications to that tube. Like, for example, your stomach, right? It's an outgrowth of that tube. And it, of course, it becomes more like a bag or a sac, right? But if you look at the small intestine, which you've seen, right, way back in chapter 1 in lab, and in the large intestine, that's a tubular structure. And so we kind of keep that. So along this whole digestive tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, which we call the GI tract, you have 4 layers, right, which you call tunics, something very similar to what we learned about when we were talking about, all right, our layers to the blood vessels there, okay? We had the 3 layers to the blood vessels. Well, we have 4 layers in the GI tract there. And so the innermost layer is referred to as the mucosa. We saw something similar to that in the respiratory tract. And then just beneath that is the submucosa. And then you're going to have the muscular layer, which is called the muscularis. And then finally, you have the outermost layer, which is the adventitia or the serosa. So how you differentiate between the adventitia and the serosa? Simple. Serosa, think serous membrane. So anytime any part of the digestive tract is covered by a serous membrane, then we refer to that outer layer as the serosa. When it's not covered by the serous membrane, we call it the adventitia. So you're going to hear a term here as we move through this chapter called retroperitoneal. And if you recall, the peritoneum is the serous membrane in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And it covers a lot of the internal organs there. So retro means what? Behind, yeah, okay? So when you have something that's retroperitoneal, it just means it's behind the peritoneum. And when we have that situation, then we call it adventitia, and we don't call it serosa. And I'll show you examples throughout the chapter here. All right, so here's a great picture here of our different tunics. All right, we'll go through all the various, all right, layers here individually, but you can see first we're going to start off with the lumen. That's the space within our digestive tract, the tube there. And then it's lined by, take a guess. What does that look like, that type of tissue here? It says it over there. Epithelium, okay? So specifically, you're going to see it lined by simple epithelium. And there's 3 important functions that simple epithelium can have. One is absorption, okay, another one is secretion, and the other one's filtration. Well, primarily, we're going to be using this one for secretion and absorption here. So we have our simple epithelium, and then, of course, what lines or what is just beneath the layers of the epithelium is known as the lamina propria, okay? And then we're going to see some smaller muscle tissue that's in that same mucosal layer called the muscularis mucosa. So you're going to see that there's glands in the vicinity, all right, of that tissue. So those glands secrete things, and we want to move those secretions into the lumen so that muscle tissue, that smooth muscle tissue, will contract and relax and help to pump those secretions here onto the surface of the epithelium or out here into the lumen. And then just deep to the mucosa, we have our submucosa. And that's where we're going to find some more glands. We're going to find blood vessels, all right? Because again, we want to absorb a lot of that material from the lumen as we're digesting it. We want to absorb it into our lymphatic system. So we're going to see lymphatics in there. We're going to see capillaries and our blood vessels in there. So we're going to see a lot of that, and I'll get into it. And then we'll see one of our nerve layers here, the nerve plexus. Then our third layer in, because one of the functions of the digestive system is motility. And so we can't have motility without muscles. So our third layer is going to be the muscularis. And so the muscularis is primarily, in most places, going to be 2 layers of tissues. In some places, it'll have 3, like in the stomach, for example. But mostly, it'll have 2 layers. The inner layer, which is a circular layer, and then the outer layer, which is a longitudinal layer. One layer helps with kind of compacting what's in the lumen, and then the other layer is going to help move it from point A, which is usually proximal to your mouth, to point B, which is distal from your mouth, more towards the anus. That's going to help us to move material through the digestive tract there. And then we'll have another nerve layer in there, the myenteric nerve plexus. And then finally, our outermost layer, which is going to be the serosa or the adventitia, dependent on whether or not it's covered by peritoneum. All right, so kind of get that idea there. We're dealing with one long tube that's got 4 layers. And so those 4 layers play very important roles here. All right, so now we're going to go into detail here about these different layers. Okay, so the innermost layer is the mucosa. That is the epithelium. Primarily, it is going to be simple columnar epithelium. And you learned this way back in chapter 5. And that's primarily going to line the majority of your digestive tract. Now, we're going to run into a couple places in the digestive tract in which that lumen is going to be lined by a different type of epithelium. For example, it's going to be lined by stratified squamous epithelium. And we know that stratified epithelium is going to be found in areas that undergo a lot of mechanical abrasive forces. So like the lining of your mouth, it's going to be covered by non-keratinized, because what's the difference between keratinized and non-keratinized epithelium? Yeah, dead cells, right? Keratin kills. So keratinized epithelium, which is pretty much the epidermis of your skin, right? The outer layer, the stratum corneum, that's going to be keratinized. All those cells are dead. So you're going to primarily find non-keratinized stratified epithelium in moist regions, for example, your mouth, right? Part of the oral pharynx and whatnot. Places that are going to be, all right, experiencing abrasive forces here. So keep that in mind, stratified squamous epithelium. All right, then deep to the actual epithelium, of course, we have our lamina propria, which is a a loose connective tissue, the areolar connective tissue. And this is where we're going to find all those blood vessels, right, that are going to help with the absorption process there of those digested contents. And then we're going to find a little bit of smooth muscle in there, which we call the muscularis mucosa. And so they're going to help, all right, move those secretions made in those glands, all right, that are deep to the epithelium. Okay, it's going to help move those secretions into the lumen. Excuse me. All right. Thoughts, questions? Not too bad, right? Makes sense? Okay. So here you can see a nice picture of the absorption process here in the mucosa. So here's the lumen with some of the digested, or I should say ingested contents here. And so we start to chemically digest them. We've already mechanically digested most of them. And then they're absorbed through the epithelium. And then they move into the lamina propria, where we have blood vessels and lymphatics. If it's a fatty substance, all right, if it's a lipid, it will wind up in the lymphatic capillaries and move into the lymphatic system, into the lumbar or the lacteal lymphatics, which eventually drain into the cisterna-chyli, and then that all eventually gets dumped into the thoracic duct, which then gets dumped back into your bloodstream. So it just takes a little extra step. Then we have our blood capillaries here, so they're going to carry the other stuff, all right, some carbohydrates, maybe some amino acids, things like that. And so most of that material is going to enter into your blood and then circulate around throughout the body. Most of the time, it's going to wind up in the liver. Okay, and then the liver is going to make some modifications to it. Obviously, the brain's going to get its fill of carbohydrates. It gets top billing, and other tissues too. Metabolically active tissues are going to get, all right, these nutrients, all right, dependent on what their metabolic demands are. So the second layer is going to be the submucosa. And notice it's also made up of areolar connective tissues, but also dense irregular connective tissues. Both are relatively have a decent amount of ground substance, which is great because that ground substance is very convenient because it allows for blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves to occupy those open spaces there. So again, that helps to facilitate the absorption. And obviously we know that the nerves are going to be sending signals, all right, either sensory input or motor output, but primarily motor output information to the effectors that line that area there. And so we have our submucosal nerve plexus here. And so this plexus, okay, which is just a grouping of nerves, is going to innervate smooth muscle to help with motility, moving things throughout the digestive tract, and it's going to activate or inhibit, all right, glandular secretions. And you remember back in chapter 22, when we were learning about the immune system, I told you that a good portion of your immune cells reside in tissues. And the majority of those immune cells that reside in tissues reside along the digestive tract. And so we refer to those as MALT structures. Now you know, right, where we got the name mucosa from. All right, so mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, mucosa because we're referring to, right, the mucosal layer there. And so, of course, you know, I don't care how well you clean your food, there's still going to be, all right, some microbes or pathogens that might be residing in or on your food. And so these tissues help, all right, to neutralize, hopefully, or initiate the immune response if they come in contact with any pathogens that might cause us harm, right? And then we call those MALT structures in the small, when we get into the lower digestive tract there, Peyer's patches, and you'll see them. They're these big just clumps of white blood cells that are just congregating in these big ball-like structures. And you'll see a lot of those along the distal part of the small intestine just before we transition into the large intestine. All right, so that's the submucosa. Then we have our movement layer, right? The muscularis. So anytime you see muscularis or muscle, you think movement. And so here we're going to see predominantly, all right, 2 layers. Like I said, sometimes we'll see 3 depending on where we are in the digestive tract here. All right, so the inner circular layer is going to constrict the lumen, all right, that of the digestive tract there. So it's basically just going to crunch down on the contents there. So that's a form of mechanical digestion because we're starting to just break things up a little bit. And then you have the outer longitudinal layer, and this, when it contracts, causes a shortening of the tube. And so that's going to move, all right, the ingested material contents, all right, from the proximal part of the digestive tract towards the distal part. So think of the outer longitudinal layer moving things through the digestive tract. The inner circular layer, just it's like a car compactor in a junkyard. It just starts to smush things up. And it does, when it does that, it helps to break things down, but it also helps with the mixing of any secretions, all right, like digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid that your stomach loves to make, all right, to really help us break down things. So it helps to mix that up, all right, in the ingested contents there. So we're going to see here another group of nerves called the myenteric nerve plexus. And so, and we'll get into the specifics here of the digestive, enteric nervous system here. But the enteric nervous system is a part of our nervous system, and I don't think that anyone learned about that in 210. I don't teach it to 210 only because you all have enough to learn about, so I wait until 211 to talk about it. But some folks consider it the third branch of the nervous system, but it's specific and exclusive to the digestive system here, right? And so it is basically going to help with those contractions that you're going to see, right, in the digestive tract. All right, we'll get into it. Okay, well, let's get into it now. All right, the enteric nervous system here, right, is going to help, all right, with a couple things. Keep in mind, when we're talking about the nervous system, there's two divisions of the nervous system. You got the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system when we're talking about the physiological aspect. And then when we're talking about the functional aspect, right, you're going to see that we have sensory and the motor. All right, or no, excuse me, central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. But when we're talking about the enteric nervous system, this is going to be specific for the digestive system. So it's going to have both sensory neurons, which are going to be connected to chemoreceptors, baroreceptors. And of course, if you see, like, for example, we've all experienced this when we've eaten a lot or drank a lot, what happens to our stomach? It expands, it distends. And so you have baroreceptors in there that detect that stretch. And so it kind of turns on the machinery of the digestive tract. Your stomach becomes more motile. It starts to kind of grind things up a little bit like a cement mixer, right? It's also going to increase its secretions there. And then how does those effects come about? Those secretions and the muscles contracting and relaxing through the motor neurons here. And so they're going to be stimulated, right, to help with mechanical digestion and chemical digestion there. Right. So we're going to see throughout this chapter, right, as ingested contents move from place to place to place, it's actually going to be one big reflex. And so, for example, some of you may notice this. Sometimes if you have a pretty decent meal, not too long afterwards, you might have to go to the bathroom. And so that's because the autonomic reflex, all right, those sensory receptors, those baroreceptors have detected material entering into the stomach, which then eventually stimulates a hormone called cholecystokinin, right, to move things, all right, from your small intestine into your large intestine. So we're going to go through all of these things. But what allows the movement of, all right, these ingested contents is going to be muscle or sphincters. Okay, we learned about there's two sphincters in your stomach. You have the cardiac sphincter, which is near the pylorus, which is the top part of the stomach. And then we have another sphincter, right, called the pyloric sphincter, which is in between the stomach and the small intestine. And so these sphincters will regulate the movement of ingested materials depending on, okay, what is going on in the digestive tract with materials being ingested, the amount. We'll get into all those. But keep this in mind that these sphincters can close off openings and they can also control when materials, all right, move from one place to another place there. And again, it's all based on, all right, a lot of these autonomic reflexes. And if you remember, a reflex is made up of a stimulus. Then you have a receptor that monitors that stimulus. And then that receptor sends that sensory input information to the control center. Okay, in this case, it could be the nervous system or it could be the endocrine system or both. And then those control centers can then determine what type of effect is going to occur and send out, all right, either through chemical messengers, through hormones and whatnot, or motor neuron output to the effectors, which are going to be muscles and glands. All right, so primarily when we're talking about the muscularis layer, like I said, we're going to see two things occurring, right, as a result of the orientation of these muscle layers, right? So that inner layer, that circular layer that is circumferential around the lumen there, its job is going to be to help with mechanical digestion. And it is going to help mix things up, almost like a cement mixer there. Right? So it's like if you look up here, as I'm sloshing this water back and forth in this water bottle here, that's essentially what that inner layer does. It causes the movement of the ingested materials to slosh back and forth, and that does a couple things. It helps with mechanical digestion, and it helps mix those enzymes and those secretions into the ingested material. And then the longitudinal layer helps with propulsion. This is how we move things along through your digestive tract. And so for the majority of the digestive tract, we call it peristalsis. And so that is literally these waves, all right, that occur in the digestive tract to move, all right, contents distally. And when we get into the large intestine, we're going to learn about what we call mass movements. And we all know, I mean, people don't really like to talk about their bathroom habits, their bowel habits there, but everyone's experienced it when you've had something to eat and then you kind of feel like a sensation down in your pelvis, all right? You might even get like a grumbling, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I got to go to the bathroom. Those mass movements, all right, are a large version of peristalsis in which we're really starting to move, all right, waste material from the large intestine into the rectum. And we get to learn about the defecation reflex. I know you're all excited about that. Everybody wants to learn about it. You can answer questions. Trust me. Okay. So this picture here is showing you, all right, how we engage in the motility there with both mixing and propulsion here. So like I said, the mixing is going to be almost like a sloshing back and forth, of material in the lumen of the digestive tract there. And then propulsion, you can kind of see here on the screen, we'll get a contraction behind the ingested material. Everything in front of the digested material should be relaxed. So when this part of the wall contracts, it pushes the digestive material distally away from the mouth. And then this area here will just continue to contract behind like a wave and just keeps pushing it distally. All right, our final outer layer is the adventitia or serosa. Like I said, depending on where this tissue is or where the digestive tract is located, whether it's covered by the peritoneum or not. So the adventitia, loose connective tissue, that areolar connective tissue, and the serosa, okay, is going to be visceral peritoneum there. Because the parietal peritoneum is going to line the internal cavity, the internal lining of your abdominal pelvic cavity there. And so you'll have that peritoneal space. And so that's that space where we have the serous fluid being secreted. So that creates lubrication. And so for those of you that have ever had their hands inside of a person, whether they're alive or dead, whether it's a cadaver or an actual patient, you can actually literally just slide the internal organs around, all right, like the small intestine, the large intestine, all right, and they move relatively freely around by design, because especially, thank goodness for that, because when pregnancy occurs, right, whether you want it to happen or not, all right, meaning baby's going to move those organs around, all right, as it's growing. And so we want that to happen. And so it's because of that design there that those organs are able to freely move around here. Okay, so let's talk about regulation of the digestive system. So you're going to have two parts of the nervous system which are going to regulate your digestive tract. One is more of a local, all right, type of regulation, and the other one is going to be more systemic type of regulation. So the enteric is going to be more of a local, right? So we're going to be dealing with the same, components here. We're going to have a sensory portion and a motor portion here, right? And so those sensory and motor portions are going to stimulate the smooth muscles locally and the glands locally to do what they do. Glands secrete, muscles move. And so basically what that's going to do is help with the mechanical and chemical digestion process there. So we're going to mix and move, right? The other part of the nervous system that's going to be playing a role here in the GI tract is going to be the autonomic nervous system, not the somatic, right? Do y'all remember the difference between the autonomic and the somatic? Somatic, all right, the sensory aspect is what you can consciously perceive. So your five senses, pain, temperature, that sort of thing, right? That's what you can consciously perceive for the sensory part. The motor part is going to be what you can voluntarily control. There's only one tissue type of an effector that you can voluntarily control, and that is what? Yep, I heard it. Skeletal muscle. Yep, skeletal muscle. So we're not dealing with that, okay? We're dealing with the autonomic nervous system. So the sensory part is going to be things that you cannot consciously perceive, okay? You cannot consciously perceive when your stomach distends by 2%. Sorry, you just can't. All right, you cannot consciously perceive when pancreatic amylase and lipase are spilling into your small intestine. You just don't know that. All right. And also the motor aspect, the effectors, you can't control. Okay. So it's going to be things that that are involuntary, which would be, all right, glandular secretions, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Well, we've already covered cardiac muscle, so that's not part of the digestive system. So we're only going to be dealing with smooth muscle here, all right? And so we're going to see these two divisions. You remember the parasympathetic, rest and digest, and sympathetic, the fight or flight? Which one do you think regulates the GI tract more? It's up there. Yeah, parasympathetic, rest and digest, right? So this one here is going to promote, all right, GI tract activity, meaning it's going to promote glands to secrete things, and it's going to promote the muscles to move things. Whereas the sympathetic is antagonistic to that. So obviously that's going to oppose things. That's going to start to turn off glandular secretions or decrease muscle motility there. So that's why, right, it doesn't happen too often, okay? There's always exceptions to the rule, marathon runners, but marathon runners, when they're running during their race, not a lot of them stop to go to the bathroom, all right? And that's because they're stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, which is slowing down, all right, or kind of inactivating the digestive tract, right? Therefore, it's going to also decrease blood flow to the digestive tract. Why? Why do we not want blood going to the digestive tract when you're running? Yeah, you need it to the metabolically active tissues. Yeah. All right. So we'll see all that happening here. Okay. So, like I said, I want you to really think of the digestive, the GI tract, as one big reflex. One big reflex. So, here, when we're talking about our nerve reflexes, either the autonomic or the enteric, right, we have what's referred to as the short reflex. And like I said, I want you to think of the enteric as more of a local type of nervous system here. All right. And so again, you'll see small parts of, say, the small intestine moving things through, or small parts of the large intestine moving things through and digesting. Right. So that's what we refer to as the short reflex. The long reflex, right, that's going to be different. That's going to be our central nervous system. Okay. Autonomic nervous system, but we're going to be dealing with the motor output aspect, how we're going to affect, right, the effectors here. So we're going to see, like I was saying, when you start to put things into your mouth and chew on them, all right, you're going to start turning on your stomach acid secretion and other enzymes that are going to be produced in your stomach. And then you're going to start to see, all right, as things start to move in from your oral cavity down through the esophagus into the stomach, you're going to start to see, as things start to enter into your esophagus, not too long afterwards, you might have to go to the bathroom. And so this is going to stimulate, that's usually because we're moving things through the digestive tract distally. And we're starting to move more contents into the rectum. All right. So we're going to discuss all that and really kind of see. But when I was learning this stuff the first time when I was in medical school, I never really appreciated, all right, how the nervous system, how the digestive system, right, was nothing short of just one big reflex here. All right. So keep in mind, that's one aspect of our control system, our control mechanism. We also have our other control center, and that's going to be the endocrine system here. Right? And so the endocrine system uses chemicals called hormones, and we're going to learn about several of these, like, for example, CCK, which is cholecystokinin. All right, we'll see the roles that it plays. All right, you have gastrin, secretin, motility. All of these things are going to help, all right, affect motility and glandular secretion in the digestive tract there. So, said it before, a reflex starts with a stimulus. And that stimulus is going to be us putting things into our mouths, all right, whether it's liquid or solid, and ingesting it, all right, down into our stomach. And so along the way, you're going to have both chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. So the chemoreceptors are going to determine, all right, depending on what contents that you ingested, right, how much and what type of enzyme is going to be secreted. All right, so we're going to learn about some of these enzymes, like lipase, for example. All right, anytime you have ASE on the end of a word, it's telling you that it is an enzyme. And so when we talk about lipase, for example, we're talking about an enzyme that breaks the chemical bonds in our lipids. When we talk about amylase, we're going to learn, all right, we have, right, an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. And we'll go through all this stuff as we move throughout. All right, and then we know what baroreceptors do. They determine, all right, or detect stretch on the wall of whatever structure that we're talking about. We saw what baroreceptors did in the circulatory system and the carotid sinuses and the aortic bodies there, and how they helped, all right, deal with compensation with the blood pressure. All right, so very similar here. When you start to ingest things and your stomach starts to descend, all right, those baroreceptors become stimulated, and then they are going to start that whole digestive tract reflex that we'll get into here as we move on through the chapter. Okay, so I'm going to quickly move through this because some of this should be a little bit of a repeat if you watch the lab video here, right? But we learned way back when in chapter 1 what the peritoneum was. And it's a serous membrane that is going to cover, all right, the organs or most of the organs of your abdominal pelvic cavity. And so it has two layers. Again, this is all review, parietal, visceral. So the parietal is going to be the layer that covers the internal lining of the abdominal pelvic wall. And then the visceral is literally going to be covering the viscera. It's going to cover the external surface of the viscera. Okay, all review. And then, of course, these two layers have, all right, in between them, okay, this cavity in which we secrete serous fluid. And just like serous fluid that we've talked about, all other serous membranes, its job is to create lubrication to help decrease our actual friction, right? And so it allows these organs, like I was saying, to slide around, all right, freely inside of your abdomen there, okay? And so you'll have people that will have some sort of issue going on. They go in and have some medical imaging done. And I'm sure that you've heard these stories that they found a tumor on somebody's such and such organ that was as big as a grapefruit, right? So a tumor is what we consider a space-occupying lesion. So it occupies space because it has mass and it has volume. And that means it's going to be pushing things to the side. And so in the abdominal pelvic cavity, it can freely move a lot of things to the side because of those membranes there, because of the peritoneum. So these two terms here, very important that you kind of understand, and they're pretty much self-explanatory, all right? Intraperitoneal organs are going to be organs found within the peritoneum. Right, and so most of the organs are going to fall into that category, and there's going to be a couple that don't. For example, right, it's not part of the digestive tract really, but the kidneys, those are retroperitoneal. They sit outside, so they wouldn't be considered to be intraperitoneal, right? But most of those organs that we're going to talk about, like the stomach, right, most of the small intestine, and then certain parts of the large intestine, those will be intraperitoneal. And then we have retroperitoneal. Retro is behind. I mentioned this before, right? These will lay, all right, behind the peritoneum. Most likely they will be against the posterior abdominal wall there. And so we're going to learn the ascending, the descending colon, right? The rectum, right? Parts of the small intestine are going to be retroperitoneal. And so we'll discuss those as we move through the chapter here. I just want you to be familiar with those two terms, okay? Intraperitoneal, retroperitoneal. It's just helpful to know. All right, so you're going to see, and I'll show it to you, and this should kind of be a little bit of a review here, all right? You've got this tissue here called the mesentery. I like to call it the fatty apron, right? But the mesentery is essentially where the peritoneum is kind of doubled back on itself. It's a double layer here. And so it's a very helpful tissue because it helps, one, it's made up of, right, a lot of fatty tissue. Remember, one of the functions of fat is to what? Insulate, but also cushion, okay? So we can use it almost like packing material. And so this mesentery here helps to cover some of these tissues there, and it's loaded with, right, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves here. And so one specific one is called the greater omentum. And so I'll show you a picture. I think I have it here. There it is. Here's the greater omentum. Look at that big thing. It's this big fatty apron that hangs down, right? And it hangs down, it connects partly to the greater curvature of the stomach, right? Parts of the intestines over here. But one of the interesting things about the greater omentum, and we've seen it, especially we've seen it in cadavers there, where somebody could get an intraperitoneal infection. And the greater omentum will actually move itself and kind of cover where that infection is. Because again, keep in mind, the greater omentum has blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. So if it's got blood vessels, that means it's got a transport system to bring immune cells in there to help combat that infection. So it's really kind of neat how the greater omentum does this. But this is the larger, all right, part of the mesentery here that's going to cover most of the abdominal organs there. And then you have the lesser omentum, and that's in between the liver and the smaller curvature or the lesser curvature of the stomach here, right? And so you'll see it attached onto the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum here. And again, it's just a smaller version of the greater omentum, but it's going to have a fatty composition to it here. I'll show you. You can see the lesser omentum up here. All right, so here's the liver, part of the duodenum, and then the lesser curvature of the stomach. So the lesser omentum, much smaller, which makes sense. That's why we call it the lesser omentum. All right, so just kind of keep in mind, nothing really exciting about the mesentery, but if you were to be dissecting a cadaver or in an abdominal surgery here, this is one of the tissues that they have to concern themselves with when they're going to get into the deeper organs there of the abdominal pelvic cavity there. And then we have a couple other structures here, the falciform ligament here. This right here, at one point, the falciform ligament, right, used to be, right, a relevant structure during embryology. So when you were inside mommy and you had your umbilical cord connected, you know, to the placenta and whatnot, the falciform ligament used to be a blood vessel. When you take your first breath, it collapses down and away, and then it turns into this ligamentous structure here. And so it helps to attach the liver onto the anterior abdominal wall there. The mesentery proper, right? This structure here is going to be seen. It's really interesting. You know, the small intestine is a very long structure. So much like the brain, okay, what confines our brain size is predominantly our cranial bones. So if our heads were twice as big, it's been theorized that our brains would be twice as big. And the reason why your brain has the gyri and the sulci is because it had to fold in on itself, all right, to make as much room as possible here. Well, same thing with your small intestine, okay? Your small intestine, not that it's theorized that if your stomach was, if your abdominal cavity was bigger, that it would be bigger, probably could be or would be, all right, but we don't want the small intestine just flopping around inside. So think of the mesentery proper as this anchor, okay? We say suspend, but it basically anchors the small intestine onto the posterior aspect of your abdominal wall. It's one of the first things when you're doing dissection that you'll cut that mesentery proper so you can pull out the small intestine there. But again, it helps to keep, and I think I got a picture in here. I do. All right, I'll come back to that. But it helps to, again, keep some support, some structure, some organization to the small intestine. And then you have this other structure called the mesocolon. So, of course, this part of the peritoneum is going to attach onto the large intestine, again, onto the posterior abdominal wall, and the same thing. It helps to suspend it and anchor it onto the posterior abdominal wall so it's not flopping all over the place. So here you can see, all right, here's the mesentery proper, right? And its anchor point is pretty much right in the middle there of the abdominal cavity, and it just kind of branches out and it attaches onto all of the different folds and tubing of the small intestine here. All right, questions on that? I know sometimes the anatomy is not terribly exciting, but I want to give you the perspective that you know that this tissue is not just flopping around in there. All right, so you got peritonitis. Anytime you see itis, there's an inflammation or irritation to the tissue. Well, in this case, it's an inflammation of the peritoneum. Person comes in complaining of abdominal pain. All right. It can be confused with stomach pain or large intestine pain. All right. But a lot of time, and for those of you that are familiar with certain bugs or microorganisms, if you took, is anyone here taking micro? I think so. Anyone here right now taking micro? Okay. What is one of the worst bacteria that you can get an infection from? Its name kind of tells you how bad it is. Clostridium difficile. Has anyone ever heard of that? I mean, that is one bad mofo. All right. And so C. difficile is a lot of times through perforation, whether there's some sort of infection that has occurred that's caused holes inside of the actual large intestine itself, right? This can spill out into the abdominal cavity, and usually patients have to take a significant amount of antibiotics, but a long duration. I've got a patient that's had a recurrent C. difficile infection, and he's on his 6th month of taking vancomycin. Is anyone here taking vancomycin is familiar with it? Vancomycin is one tough antibiotic there. So it's rough. It's rough. All right. That's why I always laugh when I watch these movies and people are getting stabbed in the stomach or shot in the stomach. I'm like, well, you're screwed, you know, because all of those pathogens that are normal flora, which we'll talk about, the microflora of our large intestine, that spills out into the abdominal cavity. And then that's a problem. Big problem. That's why back in the Wild West, if you got shot in the gut, you'd be dead because they didn't have the antibiotics to handle that. Okay, so we're going to start off. I'm going to do a quick overview of the upper GI tract, right? All the organs that we're going to see. And then we'll move through, and then I'll go through each thing, each region there in a little bit more detail here. All right, so when we're dealing with our digestive tract, keep in mind, we're going to deal with the actual gastrointestinal tract, and then what we call accessory structures or organs, which are going to help contribute to the digestion process there. All right, so the first one is the oral cavity. Right, and so in our oral cavity, we have a couple structures that help us with digestion. You've got your teeth, you got your tongue, right, and you have your salivary glands. All right, so those structures are going to be all found in the oral cavity. This is where the first part of digestion occurs, right? Mechanical digestion. You start to chew on things, right? As you start to chew on things, you stimulate that autonomic reflex that the parasympathetic nervous system, okay, is going to trigger the release of saliva. And so saliva does a couple things, all right? It helps with chemical digestion, but really what it does is it helps to lubricate the material. So you can start, all right, to form what we call a bolus, which is that glob of material that you're going to swallow down. And so the very first enzyme that's relevant for us is called, right, salivary amylase. Salivary amylase begins the digestive process of starch, okay? So starch is a complex carbohydrate. Because remember, we want to break big molecules down into smaller ones. So starch is going to have polysaccharides. We want to break those polysaccharides down into disaccharides or monosaccharides. Remember your simple sugars, right? Sucrose, fructose, galactose, all those fun things. All right, so that's what we're going to try to do. All right, so it starts in the mouth. Okay, so keep in mind, that's what the oral cavity does. So all right, now you start to swallow something back. It's going to go into your throat, right? Or the region that we're not going to call the throat anymore. We're going to call it the pharynx here. So it's going to move it into the oral pharynx. And again, during this process, we are going to start to cover, right, this bolus, this semi-solid, right, structure, all right, with mucus. What's the purpose of mucus? Hockaloogie, right? No, what do we use mucus for? Lubrication. That's right. So from here on out, from this day forward, right? It should have been in the past too, but from here on out for this chapter, mucus, anytime you see mucus, you should be thinking lubrication, right? Because remember, the majority of the lining of your digestive tract is made up of simple epithelium, specifically simple columnar epithelium, somewhat delicate. So we want to respect that, all right, single layer of epithelium, because what's just deep to that? Blood vessels. So we don't want to be bleeding into ourselves. So we're going to load that whole passageway up with lots of mucus. So we can ensure, all right, that we're decreasing friction and we're increasing lubrication. So then we move from the oral pharynx down to the laryngeal pharynx, and then just inferior to that is the esophagus. And that's that 13-centimeter tube that connects, all right, your pharynx to your stomach. Again, same type of scenario. We're going to have more mucus being secreted all that way. And then what waits at the bottom of the esophagus is the stomach. And that's kind of like a staging ground or a storage facility there. And so food will stay there anywhere between 6 to 12 hours. And so we're just going to drop some food into there. And here we're going to continue on with mechanical digestion. We're going to mix things up because we're going to see here tons of secretions, tons of enzymatic secretions are going to be just poured and dumped into the stomach. Hydrochloric acid is one of those things. We're going to learn about all the other different types of enzymes that your stomach cells are going to produce, okay, like pepsinogen and all these fun things that are going to help with the breaking down of proteins, because I'm going to tell you something right now. Proteins are a son of a gun, right? So it takes a lot of work to break those down. So we're going to put some of our heavy hitters in there like hydrochloric acid, a pH of I think it's 1.5 or 2, pretty low, very acidic. Like I said, it could burn a hole through the surface of these tables that you're sitting at here, right? So in the stomach, we're going to be mixing things up, and we're going to be transitioning that bolus now into a more I don't want to say semi-solid. It's going to go from being less solid to more liquid. Okay. And at that point, now we change the name of the ingested contents to chyme. All right. So think of chyme like this liquidy sludge. And so all the while, the stomach's going to be mixing it up. After the stomach, we're going to dump, all right, some of that stomach contents into the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine, folks, make sure you know this is the duodenum, also known as the duodenum, depending if you're from Canada or not. I don't know. I've heard it pronounced different ways. Okay. But the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. And here's the thing. I really want you to realize that the duodenum is where we start to really even add more chemicals and secretions in there, because we're really going to start to transition from mechanical digestion towards more of the chemical digestion here. Okay. So let's back it up all the way to the beginning here and go into a little bit more detail. And so some of this should look familiar to you because for the lab, right, you've labeled some of these structures here. All right, so the oral cavity. This is where we're going to be ingesting our material. You have 2 parts to the oral cavity. Everything in front or outside of your teeth, and that's called the vestibule. And then everything that's inside, or that area inside your teeth where like your tongue sits, that's going to be known as the oral cavity there. Right. So the vestibule is going to be made up of, all right, that space there where it's going to be where you're on the outside of your teeth, all right, internal to the lips, okay, just deep to your cheeks there. And then anything on the inside of your teeth, that's going to be the oral cavity proper, I guess you would want to call it. And here is where we're going to do a lot of the mechanical digestion there. This is where a lot of your salivary glands, the openings to their ducts, are going to be releasing their secretions there as you start to chew things up. So you all remember, hopefully, right, back in 210 when you were learning about the different muscles of your face, right, you learned about the buccinator muscle. And that's the muscle that helps you to puff out your cheeks. But the important aspect of the buccinator muscle is that muscle contracts and it helps to keep your cheeks flush to the sides of your teeth as you're chewing, so food's not falling out of the oral cavity proper into the labial vestibule there, right? You literally don't want food falling out of your mouth. So the buccinator muscle helps to keep it in as you're chewing there. Okay, so that's the oral cavity. The lips, all right, remember this muscle here, orbicularis oris. This is the one that allows you to pucker your lips, right? So again, orbicularis muscles are sphincter muscles, all right? They encircle an opening, and when they contract, they constrict and make the opening smaller or close it off here. Right? And so the lips have a little bit more of a color of red to them because there's more blood vessels deep to that. And so you'll notice if you kind of feel on the inside of your lips where you'll feel this little, I'll even show you, it's called the labial frenulum. Looks like this structure right here. See that right there? That's the labial frenulum. You've got an inferior and a superior one. So sometimes with babies, if they have issues with latching on during nursing, that's one of the tissues that the doctor will go in and cut. Tongue tie is the other one. The tongue tie one, and it's this one here. That's this one. That's the lingual frenulum, this guy right here. That's the one that they'll go in and cut. Yeah. I mean, your baby, you won't remember that. Maybe you will. And then you can blame it on your parents if you have any problems later on in life. I don't know. But I've seen a lot more of that happening. So I don't know if that's an overdiagnosed condition and whatnot, or because I've known 4 or 5 families within the past year. 4 out of the 5 families, all their kids have had to get tongue tied. They have that cut. So again, I won't say it's a new phenomenon. It's probably been going on for a while, but I've been hearing about it more. Okay, so I'd like to think that we all are familiar with our soft palate and the hard palate, okay, the roof of your mouth. All right, so your palate, and there's two parts to it, the soft and the hard. The hard palate is made up of the maxillary bone and the palatine bones there. It makes up the floor of your nasal cavity and the roof of your mouth there. And so the hard palate is the anterior 2/3 of your palate, and then the soft palate is the posterior 1/3 there. All right, and of course the soft palate is going to be where we're going to find that muscle tissue that we'll talk about here in a moment. All right, I already talked about the hard palate, but one of the things that you'll notice, and you can go ahead, no one's going to know if you're doing it, and I guarantee you most of you will do it. Just run your tongue along the roof of your mouth, and you'll feel these ridges up there, okay? Those are called the transverse palatine folds. Their purpose is when you're manipulating food, right, with your tongue, right, it allows your tongue to kind of move food against the roof of your mouth, and it helps to hold it there if you're doing whatever, right? But it helps, again, to kind of stop the food, all right, or push it to, or keep it to one area there as you're manipulating the area. Because that's essentially, all right, what your tongue, as far as the digestive system is considered for the tongue, is your tongue just moves the food around or the liquid. I shouldn't always say that it's always, all right, a solid, but the tongue's job is to manipulate the ingested contents there, okay? Maybe you have like a sore on the inside of your mouth and you want to keep the food away from that side of your mouth. So the tongue helps with that. So at the distal end, all right, or the posterior end, I should say, of the palate, you have that little punching bag structure that hangs down called the uvula there. And so when you actually swallow, right, the uvula, right, has a muscle in there that when it contracts, it elevates and it closes off, all right, the opening to the nasal pharynx. So essentially, it helps to prevent ingested materials from going up into your nasal cavity. Now, sometimes it doesn't work because you have fluid that comes out your nose if you laugh too hard, all right, and it failed to do its job. Or yeah, or do that, all right, then you're not doing it right, all right? But obviously, if you're having anything that comes back up into the nasal pharynx, then the uvula is not closing off that entrance into the nasal pharynx there. But that's that, again, it's that most posterior aspect of the soft palate that hangs down. All right, and then you have these two like archways here, which we call fauces, not Fauci, but fauces. All right, and so I'll show you a picture here, and then I'll come right back. Okay, if you look here on the screen, here are the fauces. You have these two arches. You have the anterior arch here called the palatoglossal arch, and then posterior to that, you've got the palatopharyngeal arch. And in between those two arches, we call those the fauces there, you'll have, this is where you'll have your palatine, tonsil. It'll sit in between. But really, what those arches are, okay, are just they're muscles. Okay, and it's nice because the names of the arches are named after the muscles. We don't have to know them, right? But you got the palatoglossus and the palatopharyngeus muscles, right? And so when they're covered over by the mucosa there, right, they form these fauces here, and so, or those muscular folds there. And again, that's the kind of almost like the entranceway into the oral pharynx there. And so, as you know, our palatine tonsils, or any tonsillar structure, is going to be a secondary lymphatic tissue structure that is going to house tons of white blood cells. Because think about it, you're ingesting, all right, things that came from the external environment. And so who knows what's on that, you know? Maybe you didn't wash your hands and you're shoving food into your mouth with your hands. And so those pathogens are coming off your hands. And so, I mean, we've all done it if we've been outside hiking or doing work. You shake your head no? You've never done it? The cleanest. I think that's what everyone says here in class about you. You're the cleanest. All right, let's talk about the tongue. All right. Again, the tongue has several different functions, right? We know how it works with phonication, with us talking, but that's not what we're talking about in this chapter. We're talking about what is its purpose, all right, for digestion. And what it does is it helps to move contents around, all right, as you're doing mechanical, all right, digestion, as you're chewing, all right, but also you learned back in chapter 16, this is where your taste buds are located. And we have, all right, numerous types of taste buds. I'm not going to review all that because I'm assuming that you still know that. But if you notice on your tongue, and some people notice more than others because they let a dog or a cat lick their face, right? You have a roughened kind of texture to the tongue. And that roughened kind of texture to the tongue is due to what we call papillae, which are these bumps on the tongue. Some of those papillae house taste buds. Most of them do not. The reason we have those papillae there is to make sure that the tongue is rough, so it creates friction so we can manipulate food and material much easier here. And then at the bottom of the tongue, we already talked about this just briefly. We have that lingual frenulum, and that helps to anchor or attach the tongue to the floor of your mouth there. All right, am I moving too fast? No, not too bad. I just don't want you guys to get bored. It is slow. Yeah, some of it was. Yeah, a lot of it is. There's some things that, yeah. All right, so we've already covered that. All right, here's the lateral. So you watched the video then. I know there's at least one person in here that didn't watch the video. I don't know who it is, but I know there's one. There's always one. There's a song I was going to start singing, but I won't. Okay, so let's talk about, all right, the histology here of the oral cavity. And we learned about this quickly, so I won't, before in chapter 5, I won't really spend too much time on it. Keep in mind, histology mimics function. All right, so think of the function or what occurs in the mouth, right? This is where a lot of mechanical digestion occurs. So that means there's going to be a lot of physical abrasion. So the lining of the oral cavity should predominantly be stratified squamous epithelium, but non-keratinized, all right? So all those cells are alive there, right? But it's stratified because when you're eating things and you're chewing, you're going to be sloughing off layers of the epithelium. So it would be bad if it was simple, because then you'd always be bleeding, right? Thank God it's not, right? So I'm almost going to guarantee you'll probably have a test question asking you about the histology of the oral cavity there. I don't know yet because I haven't made the test. All right, let's talk about our accessory structures, the salivary glands, right? We have a couple types. You have what's known as intrinsic salivary glands and then extrinsic salivary glands. So the intrinsic sit within inside the oral cavity. Those are unicellular glands, similar to a goblet cell, okay? Because goblet cells are unicellular. But these guys are constantly producing secretions, all right? It does not matter whether you've eaten food, whether you've thought about food, smell food, whatever. They're constantly keeping the lining of your oral mucosa, okay, moist with their secretions. Here's the thing that you need to know. They produce lingual lipase. But here's the catch. Lingual lipase is inactive in the oral cavity. It's not until it enters into the stomach where it gets activated, all right, by the secretions in your stomach, then it becomes active. So even though you're secreting it, it's not acting on breaking down fat, because that's what lipase does. It breaks down fat, hence the name lipase. So I can almost guarantee you'll see a question in regards to, all right, what digestion or what macromolecule or something along those lines, what gets digested first in the mouth? And there's only one, which is what? Starch. Right, good. So that salivary amylase is going to be the active enzyme. Lingual lipase is not activated, okay? So don't confuse the two. All right, so our extrinsic salivary glands, this is the one that you're familiar with the named, all right, salivary glands. The parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual. Okay, so these are the ones that are going to create most of the saliva, especially when you start to think about food, smell food, all right, even hear food. Believe it or not, right? When you hear someone cooking sometimes, your mouth can start to water, and that's the beginning there of the digestive process there. So let's start off with the first one here, the parotid salivary gland. All right, the parotid, this is the largest of the salivary glands, and this is the one that sits just anterior to your ear. Right, this is also the one when it gets inflamed when you get mumps. Right, and so it doesn't make most of the saliva, but it makes about a quarter, 30% here. And so if you watch the lab video, it goes through the different types, not the different types, but the name of the duct there, okay, of the parotid duct. But it actually will release its secretions, right, in the upper part of your mouth between the second molar there. All right, the other two salivary glands are the submandibular and the sublingual. Submandibular makes the majority of your saliva. All right, and so this one sits, excuse me, on the bottom here of the floor of your mouth here. And so it is going to be, all right, more medial, whereas the sublingual is going to be more towards the front. All right, but the submandibular makes the majority, and so its duct will also release its saliva on the bottom part or the floor of the oral cavity. And the sublingual makes very, very little, but it has multiple ducts, right? Multiple small openings that also are on the floor of your mouth. And so they'll be releasing its minor contribution, all right, to the saliva. Okay, but keep in mind, sublingual is in front, submandibular is more towards the back. All right, this part gets pretty boring, so I'm going to kind of move through the histology here of the salivary glands here. So your salivary glands are made up of two types of cells, mucus cells and serous cells. Mucus cells make a thicker type of secretion, all right, that mucin, once it's mixed with water, turns into mucus. The serous is going to be more of that watery type of secretion, but this one contains the electrolytes and then that salivary amylase that I was telling you about. So that's going to create the secretion for the starches. All right, I think I even have a picture. I don't. There it is. All right, so here you can see parts of these salivary glands are going to have those mucus secreting cells and then the serous secreting cells, right? And so the mucus cells, mucin, okay, and the mucin is going to help with that lubrication and also with helping to hydrate the material that you're chewing up before it forms the bolus there. All right, I love this stat. 1 to 1.5 liters of spit is formed a day. That's crazy. That's a lot. And when I used to wrestle in high school, and this is before, well, I don't want to mention what I was just going to say, but when I used to wrestle in high school, I had to cut weight. And this is before they really were strict with how much weight you could cut. And when I was a freshman in high school, I wrestled 105. I almost certified, but I was like 5'10". I was like a stick, you know. Look at one of the skinniest people you know, and I literally looked like a skeleton with skin strapped over it. All right. And I used to spit into a cup at night when I was lying in bed just to get rid of weights, you know. And so when I think about how much spit I got rid of, I was like, well, I don't think I got rid of a liter or 1.5 liters, but I remember anything we could do to get rid of any type of mass or anything to lose that weight. So your saliva, if you look here, we said the majority of the components to saliva is going to be the amylase there, but also look, mucin we know, but lysozyme, boom. Lysozyme, what is that? It's an immune secretion, right? It's lysozyme is an enzyme that helps with the immune response. So if you've ever seen it, we've all done it, where you've cut yourself and you lick your wound there. You've never done that? Yeah. Oh, that's right. Well, Miss Clean never does that stuff. Yeah, but have you ever seen, like, you've heard the saying, like, when animals get into a fight, they lick their wounds afterwards? That's the reason why, all right? Because their saliva has these defense, all right, these immune secretions here to help, all right, sanitize these cuts here. So most people, all right, most normal people I know have licked a wound or whatever if they've cut themselves, all right? So here's what the purpose of saliva is, okay? As you are eating your food, all right, you're going to take something that's solid and make it into something that's softer. So the saliva helps, one, when we're mixing it in, it helps to lubricate whatever it is that we're swallowing, helps to mix in the enzymes there for the chemical digestion part. And so we'll see here, right, as we transition from that solid food, we start to form this structure here called the bolus. All right. And so that bolus is going to help, all right, with the swallowing process there. So we move from like this big chunky thing, whatever it is that we took a bite out of, to something that's a little bit softer. All right, pretty much when we're dealing with salivary secretions, we're dealing with the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, right? And so therefore, right, when we're dealing with what type of secretions that we're gonna have, right, usually is dependent on what the chemoreceptors in your taste buds are going to determine. And so they're gonna send that information, and we kind of learned a little bit about this back in chapter 16, up to, all right, your brainstem there, where the control center is, where the salivary nuclei are. And so they are going to then cause the parasympathetic nervous system, right? That's going to be your glossopharyngeal nerve. Vagus plays a role, all right? But that is going to stimulate the salivary glands in your mouth. Because remember, there's only 4 cranial nerves that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Do y'all remember those 4? You don't have to name them. You can just give me the numbers. Well, vagus is 1. So it's cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. So that would be oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus there. All right. Skip that. We talked about that. We talked about that. Looking good on time. Okay. So mechanical digestion. That process is called mastication in the mouth as you're chewing, right? If you recall, back in 210, you learned the muscles of mastication, masseter, right? Temporalis. You didn't have to know the lateral and medial pterygoids, all right? But those are also muscles that play a role in that mastication. And essentially what you're doing, all right, to really simplify things, is when you're breaking down those large molecular structures, you're going to, one, break them down, but you're going to expose, all right, the surface area of that material. One, so we can get as much saliva mixed in there. So if there's any starches in there, we can start to break those down there, right? But also, the main goal is just to make those larger structures smaller, so it's easier for your stomach, because that's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for mechanical digestion. It just makes it easier. That's why they always say chew your food. And it's not just baloney, all right? Chewing your food helps, all right, with the digestive process. And they found that folks that chew their food, all right, slower, all right, I'm guilty of this because sometimes I just want to eat on the go, and I can inhale food faster than all get out. But if you take your time, chew your food into smaller bits and pieces, you'll get much better surface area exposure for the digestive and absorption process there, and you'll get more out of the nutrient, more out of the macromolecules there. All right, so keep that in mind. Just kind of keep that in mind. So of course, when you start to chew, it's almost like, not the same thing, but almost like a positive feedback loop. All right, as you chew, you produce more saliva, more salivation. I can't remember who the comedian was. I think Jim Gaffigan said chewing gum is like practicing eating. All right, and that's essentially what you do when you're chewing gum. That chewing motion there stimulates saliva production there. Okay. Teeth. Is anyone here going into dental hygiene or anything? No. No. Okay. All right. Usually in some of my courses, I have some people going, they want to do the. Oh, okay. So you know what's up. So this is usually where people start to take notice here if they're going into the dental field here when I start talking about the teeth here. All right. So I'll kind of move through the teeth here relatively quickly. Okay. So our teeth, right, play a huge role in that mechanical digestion. And we'll go through we'll finish up today talking about the teeth, and then we'll break for lab here. All right. So when we're talking about the actual tooth, there's 3 parts to it. The part that you see when people are smiling, that's the crown. So when you hear somebody say, I just had some crowns put on, all right, that's what they're saying. I just had the white part of my teeth fixed or augmented here, and that's what you're seeing there. And then the crown kind of tapers down into what we call the neck, and that's where the gum line comes up to. So the gum line will surround the neck, and then the part of the teeth that you really don't see are the roots there, right? So if you've had a root canal, I've never had one. Has anyone here had a root canal? Oh, all right, because I heard they feel good. That was a joke. All right, but the roots are going to be, all right, and I'll show you here, but down in the roots, that's going to form that, remember the gomphoses, that peg and socket joint that we learned in chapter 9? Are you really saying that you remember that, or are you just, okay. Because it's a cool name. Yeah. I was always trying to get my wife to tell her dentist, I said, ask your dentist about the gomphoses, and she never would do that for me. But anyways, because I don't want to ask. I want her to ask. I think it's funnier that way. But anyways, all right. So that's what forms that peg and socket joint, are the actual roots there. And then you have these small, tiny ligaments that come out from, all right, the actual roots and attach onto, all right, the actual bones of the maxilla and the mandible. And those little ligaments are called the periodontal ligament. All right. So let's take a peek here. First of all, well, show you a picture. Where's my thingy there? All right, so here's the exposed part. That's the crown. Then where it starts to taper down, that's going to be the neck, and that's where the gum line inserts. And then you can see the roots here. All right, and so those are going to form the gomphose joints along with the periodontal ligaments here that kind of hold that tooth into place there. All right, so let's talk about, all right, what covers the teeth, the different parts of the teeth. All right, so you got dentin, enamel, pulp cavity, root canal, all right, and then the cementum there. So the dentin makes up most of, if you look right here, you can see the dentin makes up, it's like that brown part, that makes up most of the mass of the tooth. And then on the crown region there, the white part that's external to the dentin, that's the enamel. Enamel is the hardest substance in the body. I don't know if you knew that. All right, but it is the hardest substance of the body. Both dentin and enamel are harder than bone. All right, and another thing that I learned, all right, because I'm always asking dentists questions, is that as you get older, your enamel becomes harder. And so you'll see, unless there's a genetic component involved, all right, you can always use genetics as the excuse, all right, but as you get older, you get less cavities. And that's because the enamel is hardening more. All right, so you have a hollow space. You look confused. You never heard that?
I don't think that's true.
Oh, that's true. I've asked dentists. Several. Every dentist I've ever had, I've asked that question. And I've only had one. I'm kidding. Well, no, that's different though. I mean, aside from that, look, you no, I eat candy. In fact, I eat too much candy. But no, I mean, yes, older people can, but you got to ask yourself, what are they doing? Like, are they taking care of themselves? Are they brushing their teeth? Are they using dental floss? Are they, what kind of food are they eating? Are they smoking? Are they drinking? That's true. Yeah, but think about it. What causes a cavity?
I don't know. I've never had a cavity.
You never had a cavity? See, there you go. Now you never will, because as you get older, your enamel becomes harder. But usually it's because of the flora in your mouth. It's usually bacteria. So what do bacteria like? Sugar. Yeah, they're like most things. And so if you eat a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet, that bacteria will love to hang out there. So in the center of your tooth, all right, in the roots and whatnot, you have the pulp cavity. So it's a space. And inside of that pulp cavity, you're going to have pulp, but that includes, all right, some connective tissue and blood vessels and nerves. All right, so if you look at the picture here, you can see, look at all, here's the pulp cavity, all right, going all over the place. And so you can see that from these vessels down here, you've got, all right, arterioles, venules, and then some lymphatics and some nerves that are all going to be here within the pulp cavity there. All right, root canal, that's going to be, whoops, this area right here, right, where the roots of the tooth actually insert down into the maxilla or into the mandible. And then we're going to see covering the roots this substance called cementum there. Dental caries are just a fancy way of talking about a cavity there. And so it chews through all of that material there. All right, I think, oh yeah, let me stop here. I went over a little bit, but you guys loved it. Well, look how much you learned. Now you know that